Ever feel unsure on how to talk about the injustices in our society regarding race, class, and gender? I know I have. And on today's episode, I'm having a conversation with a global leader for racial and gender equality who is sharing her beautiful journey of movement making and advocacy. This conversation went in an unexpected direction, so I hope you listen in. What we talk about is really important for us all. Welcome to this episode of She Made It. I'm your host, Elle Zimmerman, and I'm joined by my co-host, Clara. Welcome, Clara.
Thank you, Elle. I'm glad to be here as always.
Yes, and this was a very interesting conversation, and many of us shy away from tough conversations about race, class, social injustice because we're afraid we'll say the wrong thing. And in this one, I said the wrong thing.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. And I even thought about editing the conversation. And I thought, this is valuable. We kind of went down this path that I don't think either of us was expecting. But it really took a beautiful turn. And it was this opportunity for Tanya to sort of guide me through these kind of uncomfortable, difficult conversations. And she has this authentic, direct, sort of tough way, but yet she didn't point things out to shame me or make me feel bad. She just taught me and she really guided me and was an example of how to have a better conversation around this topic.
Yeah, that sounds so powerful. As we were going through the resurgence of Black Lives Matter last year, the video that I saw of someone speaking on the topic that was so powerful was that we should speak up even if we're afraid we'll say the wrong thing, because the worst thing that can happen is that we'll be corrected, and that's really not something we should be afraid of. So I'm
and if you listen
to hear
in,
that.
Yeah, and if you listen into She Made It, you'll hear that I was corrected. But it was lovely. It was really great. But it made me think about the importance, when you talk about speaking up and you talk about using our voice even when we're unsure, that really is about confidence. It's about finding our voice, finding the power. So I'd love to share. Actually, Claire, why don't you share a little bit about the opt-in that we've created?
Sure. So before we dive right into your conversation with Tanya, Elle and I are really excited to be sharing some totally free resources with anyone who listens to the podcast. So if you go to ellzimmerman.com/downloads, you'll see all four, but the one that we want to highlight is the one that's about cultivating confidence from the inside out. So you can click on that one, and it's there to guide you as you learn to share your voice. So a great resource if you're interested.
Yeah, and this is, I'd say, relevant for if you're in a job and you're called on to give presentations. Maybe you're on the ebb of a difficult conversation. Maybe it's just you're noticing that you're not speaking up, in a crowd or in a social group. It's really about how do we feel inside and how does that affect how we show up on the outside?
Completely.
So one other thing that I'm going to share at the beginning before we jump into the conversation, and this sort of was a real strong takeaway for me from this interview, this conversation with Tanya, was that I made a commitment to add diverse voices to She Made It. So I'm sort of sending out a call. Like if you know a woman of color with a creative soul and a story to share, I would love to hear from you. And Clara, how would they share that information with us?
Honestly, the best way would be to email me. You can reach out to clara@ellzimmerman.com, and we would love to hear from you and hear your suggestions.
Yes, and also because it's a nice way for me to plug Instagram, you can also find me on Instagram at @ellzim, ZIMM, and you can direct message there. Because we really want to make a commitment to share a more diverse voice, because she is not, she encompasses all of us, right? Every color. So that's my commitment.
Absolutely. So Elle, are you ready for me to share Tanya's background before we listen to your interview with her?
Yes, this incredible woman. Please share.
Yes. So Tanya has been on the forefront of the anti-racist movement for the last 35 years. And as a movement maker, she has worked with the Women of Color Network, Inc., and is an advocate for the underserved and the vulnerable, specifically survivors of domestic abuse. She is now the president and CEO of Lovelace Consulting Services, Inc., an independent consulting firm that provides high-level consulting to organizations seeking social transformation. Tanya is dedicated to creating inclusive policies and environments, providing vital support to those frequently overlooked. And here are a couple of fun facts. As a global leader for racial and gender equality, she has been invited to the White House to meet with Joe Biden, and she's also worked with Gloria Steinem. So stay tuned for this inspiring conversation with Tanya Lovelace and Elle Zimmerman.
Welcome to this episode of She Made It. I am your host, Elle Zimmerman, and I'm here today with my guest, Tanya Lovelace. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, and I'm so glad to be here with you, Elle.
Yeah, and Tanya, where are you recording from? Where are you calling in from?
I am currently in Silver Spring, Maryland. This is my new home, yes.
Yeah, so Silver Spring, Maryland, is that... I'm not familiar with Maryland, although I know part of it is near D.C. Are you in the D.C. area, or am I way off base?
Yes, no, I am in the DMV, as they say, in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area.
Okay. Absolutely. And that's a great place for an advocate, for a social justice warrior, right?
It sure is. I moved here for that purpose.
Awesome. So there's so much to talk about with you today, Tanya, because you've had this incredible journey. You have a professional journey, you have a social justice journey, you have a survivor journey. And I'd love to start sort of where you are right now. And we'll kind of go back to where the story started. But share with me your new venture, your new entrepreneurial sort of like expansion.
Absolutely. So I am just really pleased to talk about that. In October 2020, in the midst of COVID, I launched a new consulting firm, which is Lovelace Consulting Services, Inc. And we help individuals, systems, and organizations achieve social, political, and professional transformation through executive and staff coaching, strategy, and development. And what that really means is that we sit with and support individuals and systems and organizations in really achieving goals that they have set for diversity, equity, inclusion, for anti-racism work, as well as to support them in their organizational development processes. And these can be well-established organizations who are really seeking to not just address diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to really consider ways to restructure how they do what they do, how to declog their systems in a way, right? How to open them up so that they are more intersectional, so that we are decolonizing the approaches that people are taking to their work, and really assist with internal and external change, so that they are really walking the walk and talking the talk. If you're going to say in community that you are going to centralize more voices in marginalized communities, but if in your organization, folks who represent those communities don't feel heard, then that's not congruent. And so we're really helping folks consider and really be more congruent in their work, so that their internal processes match what they say in community.
Oh, that's good. That's so good. And knowing the journey, knowing what you have sort of pioneered, it feels like this incredible culmination of all your talents, all your gifts into one incredible offering. I do wonder, obviously, June of 2020, anti-racism was this huge, large national conversation. More of us were becoming involved, marching, posting, donating. Did this consulting firm come out of that? Like, where did the idea come from? Because in the midst of the pandemic is a crazy time to launch a new business, but also could be the most perfect of times. So how did that whole event in June and the months to follow and this passion, energy, anger that came from that fuel part of this new step for you?
Well, it's really, I would say, 35 years in the making. So for me, I started really doing social justice, movement making, community organizing work when I was 19, right? And I had to, and it really came from out of my own personal need. And while and my personal need on a campus that was predominantly white, and going through my first women's studies course and recognizing and being told actually by my white professor, women's studies professor, she told all of us, that we were women. So first of all, that blew me away because I was 19. I was like, I'm a what? That was. And then she said, and then for those of you who are Black, who are Latin, who are Asian, who are Native, I want you to embrace the idea that you are women of color. And that too blew me away. And somehow or another, really sitting with all of that changed how I began to think of myself and helped me understand why I felt the way I did, why I felt so marginalized. And that was not even language I knew. I just knew I felt that I was sitting outside of this big fishbowl, right? And so we created a space called Sanctuary, a support group for women of color. And from that point on, it was in my blood to make change. Fast forward to in 2020. There were various circumstances that caused me to continue to be in individual spaces, thinking to myself about offerings that are needed right now. By 2020, I had been doing nonprofit work, nonprofit leadership for 25 years. At that point, I had been at the helm of a nonprofit, a women of color led nonprofit for 18 years. I had pulled it out of two other organizations, two mainstream nonprofits. I'd worked with a beautiful team of women of color around the country to over a long period of time to get it prepared to spin off. And so we spun it off in 2014. And so I was sitting in this organization that had spun off. It was up, it's running. And what I realized is that there was more to do. And so it's not, and more for me to do. So it was, yes, there was a lot happening in the country, but it also became more about my own individual interests and abilities that I wanted to be able to share and do on a broader scale. And so I have been able now to create this entity that allows me to do virtually anything and to shape shift in ways that I now can do, as opposed to being at the helm of a national nonprofit. Now I can sit with people who run national nonprofits.
Right.
And I can sit with corporations, right? And I can sit with universities, and I can sit with individuals and people who themselves are really trying to determine what their path is going to be. This is the work that I now get to do. And I'm so delighted to be able to be in these more intimate relationships with people, right? And to really, really dig in there and sit with them and be with them and thinking about it. And so it was more of an individual choice. But I can say probably that much of what happened in the country has created some real change within me, and has given me an opportunity to think more about where do I want to be in this current trajectory of social justice, and I feel like this is where I need to be for the moment. And I don't know, I might be running a nonprofit again in the next couple of years. But right now, in this time, in this moment, this feels like the right positionality for me.
Yeah. So if you're running a nonprofit, I'm guessing you're more leading others to have those intimate conversations.
100%.
And now you've chosen to be in the conversation.
Yes, now I'm kind of in the fire with people.
Yeah.
So it's as opposed to, navigating how we will put out the fire, I'm kind of in it with folks and saying and trying to support folks and sort of getting out of it. But being able to do it from a more strategic approach, meaning that at this point, it allows me to sit with, I've been sitting primarily with executives, with the CEOs, with the co-executive directors, with the principal leaders of their organizations, and with staff in these organizations, and assisting them to better position themselves to be to really maximize their best selves in doing this work.
Yeah. So I'm going to tell you, Tanya, because I'm white. People know that. And you're a woman of color. And there's a little bit of uncomfortableness in this conversation for me. And I'm just going to say, not because of you, but because I'm afraid of doing the wrong thing. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. I'm afraid of being racist without even realizing it. And so when you're having these conversations, who are you talking with? Is it okay to say, is it okay for me to ask, are you having conversations with the white leaders, or are you having conversations with the people of color? Who are you consulting with?
Well, right now my work is about 50-50. My first consulting gig was with a mainstream group, a global group, where their staff is both people of color and folks of European descent, whether they are in Europe or they're here in the United States. And they have, they have co-leadership. They have a man and a woman co-leadership. They have a person of color and a white person co-leadership. And so the work that I did with them, they had a real interest in a similar approach, that they had been doing global work, which had been nation to nation, region to region, and really lifting up broader issues of poverty, of various forms of, whatever the myriad of issues, gender justice, which is their primary focus, as well as, patriarchal violence and all sorts of other things. However, race was not something that was like their primary work. And so they understood, though, the way in which Black Lives Matter really ignited the world, right, around this, and where people began to really see and sit with the fact that anti-Blackness and racism was very present wherever they were, wherever we are in the globe. This is present. And so they wanted to pivot their work so that they could better centralize this issue of race. And so, and they too wanted to get to a point where they understood that by omission. So you're saying that you're afraid to say something wrong.
Well, and that's what I want to ask. I do, and I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to ask, what can you provide for me to help me feel more comfortable? So I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off there. So,
well, first, I just wanted to clarify with them. They understood that by omission and not talking about it, right, was in and of itself a problem, right? And so they wanted to have more engagement. I mean, it's not that they weren't talking about marginalized communities, but they understood that they needed to ensure that race and racism was a large part of their conversation. And so for you, so first of all, as a woman of color, it's actually not my job to make you more comfortable, right? Like, it's not my role to do that. Yeah. What my role is to do, though, is to sit with you. As you say, this is something that's challenging for me. And I say my role, I mean, because that is a role I choose, right? Because there are a lot of folks who this is not what they choose to do. they would place their social justice energy primarily in focusing on Black communities, centralizing, supporting, lifting up their voices. I have parts of my work in which I do that, and I sit with largely Black women and women-led organizations, Black women-led organizations and women of color-led organizations and various ethnicities, and support them, Asian and Latin and Native women. I sit with them. I'm supporting them in their work as well, and helping to centralize their voices and helping them to amplify their voices. So I do that. When I'm sitting with folks who are white, I support them in achieving what they have in mind. And so, Elle, I ask you, it's not my job to make you feel more comfortable. My question is what is your intention? What is your intention in having me on today? What is your intention in this conversation with the Black woman today?
Well, first of all, I love how you started the conversation of I'm a woman. And so my role, my job is to serve women who are seeking fulfillment, authenticity, alignment with their purpose, and authentic living. So that's first and foremost. And your story, it just spills out this true, grounded, authentic version of yourself that you live so clearly, so authentically. So that's first. The second is, I do want to know, what is the most important work that white people and non-people of color can be doing right now?
Yes. So, then back to how to make you more comfortable in this conversation, because now you have me interested, Elle, right? So I really want to take it a step further and to ask you, what do you think is the best thing that you could be doing to support and to address racism?
Well, first, I would say having a conversation like we're having right now.
Yes.
And second, I would say continue to be a learner, be curious.
Yes. And thank you, Elle. And what I'm also thinking about is you have this wonderful platform, right? And for me, I'm getting this opportunity on your platform to talk about my work. I imagine that you probably have a whole myriad of listeners who are people who typically may not be hearing from or listening to women of color. And so I wonder how you think you could use your platform to support women of color.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I am very mindful of trying to share a diverse voice, whether it's age, whether it's, area of expertise, whether it's race. So that is part of my mission, is to share a diverse story. I just interviewed someone yesterday who has 7 children. And then I interview women who have chosen to be, without children by choice. So for me, I think it is about how can we learn, how can we become better versions of ourselves. And I guess, Tanya, I'll go back to, and you're right. I said the wrong word. It is not your job to make me feel comfortable. I desire to feel more comfortable. I desire to feel more confident in the conversation. I desire to speak authentically without the fear of hurting someone or being racist.
And I think that one of the things that here are a couple of things that I'm thinking related to that. First of all, so we are not responsible for the way in which society has been constructed, right? The construction of whiteness itself is a construction. Really, people are from various parts of the world and various ethnicities. And originally, Europeans in this country came to this country and really represented those various parts of the world that they were from. Over time, which there's a whole list of ways and this is a part of the things that I do with organizations where I sit with them and talk about and help them look at, really tracing the origins of race and how this got constructed. but whiteness is the construction, right? And it has become really a bargain among white people to come together under this construct of basically being non-people of color, right? Or being white. And what this allows is a unified voice in whether you are silent or whether you are actively supporting it. Or whether you are participating in systems without knowing it. It is to reinforce this idea that white people are center, other communities on the outside. It creates what might be considered normal or what might be considered regular or those kinds of terms, which actually ends up really meaning white. And so I'm lifting that up because the idea that, so the work would be to deconstruct that approach that says that there is one sort of way of being or one way or one community that should be center. And by continuing to interrupt that system, it begins to shift the system so that you are decentralizing voices that are primarily white. So that means then by doing things, Elle, by having diverse voices on here, and also by taking the chance, right, of having these tough conversations, and by making mistakes, and by also a few things, by making those mistakes, being willing to say it was a mistake, then being willing to hear or being willing to engage with folks who can support you in pivoting the approach that you took. And then being willing to say, hey, this is the new approach I'm taking on that. Like you just did in this conversation, where I said, for me, that's not really my job. You taking a little time in our conversation, we're going back and forth, and then you coming back and saying, hey, I actually have let that sit here for a second. And I realize that's probably not the best way to say it, but here's what I really intend. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is exactly just what needs to be happening, Elle. And I think that so I believe that I would love to see more white people having these conversations. I would love to see more white people talking about the bargain of whiteness and what that looks like, because and how that positions white people in a way that's not really realistic. It's actually also not really authentic, in the sense that the world is actually not predominantly white. The world is actually predominantly people of color.
Yeah.
And in this country, the change is happening more and more rapidly. And it's also, and it's not just the people, but it's also then the needs of the people. It is the concerns of the people. It is the real lived experiences of the people that is now shifting policy. And people are, I think right now, are fighting for their very lives to keep systems in place that don't actually reflect America, right?
Yep.
The United States, right? They don't, and also don't actually reflect the world.
Right. I want to comment on something, a word that you said that just evokes sadness and almost a bit of a shame in me. And it's the word bargain, the white bargain. And that I just feel really like, ugh. And it makes me, I'm emotional about that. And then there's the feeling flawed, like I'm part of the problem. And you did start this by saying, I'm not responsible. You're not responsible for the way the society has been constructed.
No. That
was very freeing for me to say, okay, I'm not the cause, but I can be part of the cure. But there is this, not everybody has that open-mindedness. There's a lot, it feels from my position that there's a lot of blame to the white person. And so that's where my fear comes. Like, I don't want to upset further. I don't want to confirm that in any way. And so I guess my question would be to you, this fear of speaking up, or even this whole concept of virtue signaling, like by having you on my show, there's a part of me that feels like, ooh, is it going to look like I'm just trying to be anti-racist. It's not that, I mean, I didn't even think of you, to be honest with you. We spoke that I connected with you through my aunt, and I didn't even think of you as a Black woman. I thought, oh, this is an interesting story. She's starting an entrepreneurial venture. And then as I started to learn this incredible story and this side of you that is very much, for the justice of women of all color, I wondered, gosh, is this going to look like I'm trying to do something inauthentic?
Wow, you've packed a lot in that. And so let's first of all say a shout out to Janice. She is a dear, dear person, dear friend of mine who she and I used to sit for hours and hours and hours. I mean, I really do mean hours. I mean, we used to dig into these conversations. And this was in the 90s. She and I both were on in an organization where these conversations were front and center, and we were doing anti-racism training together, and we were sitting in many different seats with that work. And it's just, I find it so, there's just such kismet, really, that I'm now speaking with you and we're having a similar conversation. I really consider that to be such a blessing. And so, Elle, I am so grateful actually that we've met in this virtual way, in this way, and that we that we are connecting. And what that so with that said, right? What there are there are a few things. Yes, this system has been created. No, none of us are responsible for how this system has created, how this cage of oppression has been created. We don't actually we did not create this. And yes, we can all be a part of the solution in the various roles that we play and the various experiences we have within that. But then there is that part that's in the middle. And the part that's in the middle is, while you're not responsible and while you can be a part of the solution, you also have to recognize where you sit in the system now. And what that has to do with is experiencing privilege from whiteness, right? From this bargain, from this system that has been created that says that you don't have to pay attention to various things that happen on a day-to-day basis. The system has created it so you don't have to. The system has been created so that you can live your life without thinking about your racial identity, about thinking about how it impacts others, and taking various things for granted. It's set up that way. That doesn't mean you have to live life that way. It means that you can actually very much on a day-to-day basis continue to take more and more control of the way in which you think about yourself and the way in which you see things, and to begin to look and see what are ways in which you may have not noticed or recognized how your privilege plays out, that you actually do have a responsibility for. So you don't necessarily have responsibility for how the system was set up. And yes, there are lots of ways to participate in the solution. And a large part of it is to become aware now, is to begin to seek awareness at this time. And the blaming aspect, I think people call it blame when they are being brought to attention what is there. That feels like blame because it feels like something you haven't seen before. You haven't had to talk about. You haven't had to be brought to your attention. But there are those of us who live in the wake of, in the very presence of, and in the shadow of white privilege all the time, who know this all the time. This is our lives every day. The things we know, the hurdles we have to jump over every single moment of every single day is how we live. And when we say to people, to white people, this is how we live, this is, and it's not a matter of whether or not you tried to do that. Most often, it's just a matter of fact. It's just a matter of how the system has been constructed. The job of white folks in that context is to hear it, to believe it, to begin to figure out, A, what would it look like if you started to share aspects of what you have? B, how can you make it more accessible for people to have, to be able to achieve and to have access to similar things, right?
Explain that a little bit deeper. What do you mean share, give access? What would that be tangibly?
So tangibly, what you could do today is say, hey, did I bring on Tanya just for this conversation? No. I mean, and if you, I mean,
actually, I did not expect this.
Like you said, Judith, I
so
didn't
the answer
expect
is
either.
no.
I actually didn't expect this either. I mean, I thought we were going to be talking about Lovelace Consulting Services, and then we were going to talk about my lovely little way of getting, but
we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Yeah. But we've gone in this direction that I think is of use. And I think that what it means then is then you should, if somebody could make that claim, Elle, then the question would be, how can you then construct your platform in a way that actually does mean that you are more than intentional of making sure that you are having more diverse programming, having more people on a frequent basis, talking about all areas of diversity on a lot of different levels and a lot of different scales. And if you are also talking to people who are not doing this work, right? Maybe what you start to do is start to have conversations when you're having white people on and saying, hey, I know that this is the work and whatever else, but also, how are you seeking to address what's happening right now globally in the work you're doing? How can we as white people begin to take steps to move forward? When I say that it's about deepening the conversation and about creating access, it is that Elle Zimmerman has a platform. How is Elle Zimmerman going to use that platform? And then how can you do that in a way that doesn't mean that this is the one time on this platform you're having this conversation?
Right. Yes.
That's
yes.
Yeah. And it's okay to start here.
Yeah.
And then it just means, where do you go from here?
Right. So thank you for being so gentle with me. I do have a question, because I do want to switch gears. I know, because again, I'm going to tell you that I'm speaking for a lot of women like me. And I do believe that this conversation is going to be super helpful. And I'm willing to, I mean, I'm hoping that I'm willing to just really say, here's what I don't know, and here's what I'm afraid of. And I want help, and I want to do this better. I want to be more aware. I want to be part of the solution. So I'm very grateful. I will ask you though, yeah, go ahead. Sure.
So now the coach in me is saying, because this is what I do. I do ally coaching with folks as well. So this is what I would say. I'm hearing you say, I want to be. And so what that is going to mean then is it's going to be critical for you then to begin to make concrete decisions on what that's going to look like. And then your platform should begin to shift a little so that you are beginning to do that, both for you personally as well as your platform.
I love you. You're giving me homework.
Listen, you can't be in conversations with me
right. But you're right. You're right. We can sit here and we can talk, and it sounds all great. And yes, that's a great. But what am I going to do? That's it.
You think I'm being gentle with you, but the real truth is that I'm being real with you, and then I'm going to continue to do so. So I'm going to be watching you.
Thank you. So my question, I do want to shift gears, but my last question on this topic is, what is the wrong way for a white person to engage in anti-racism work?
Well, oh my goodness.
Because that's my fear, that I'm going to do it wrong.
We do need 10 more hours for that. But what I would say is that, first of all, the wrong way is to not begin at all. So I think that would be the wrong way, first of all. The second wrong way would be to think that it is our job to help you. It is that our job, not so much to help you, because for me, you could pay me to help you. So when I say that, I don't mean you, I mean just anyone in general, that, and not just pay, but you can, right.
It's not my Black friend's job to help me.
No,
it's my job. Yeah.
But it is but it could be a consultant's job to help you with that. So that
Correct.
doesn't mean you can't get help. It just means that it's not your Black friend's job to do that.
Right.
That's absolutely right.
Right.
And I think that the wrong way to do it is to think that it's always and only to come to spaces that people of color have set up for these conversations, when actually what I feel like does not happen enough. And the reason why we continue to see more and more folks be emboldened in this topic and in this issue, in the issue of racism, and being more blatantly racist and more blatantly, white supremacists, is because people within their own communities are not having these conversations. It's because there is not enough circles. There are not enough circles of white women bringing together other white women to say, we really need to be challenging each other on this bargain of whiteness. We really need to be challenging each other on what it means that we are a primarily white community that has really insulated ourselves and really have not paid attention to what's happening in community itself. And we need to talk about what our responsibility is in this. We need to talk about how we came to this place of isolation. We need to talk about what it means that we are turning an eye away from the ills that's happening and the racism that's happening around the world, and how we participate in that racism, how we participate in this white privilege, how we participate in this system. Yeah. And so if that is not happening, so because I have a lot of, I'm teaching at a university as well right now, University of Colorado, Denver. I'm teaching interpersonal violence, social change, and in interpersonal violence, leadership, and social change. And in those conversations, I'm primarily teaching white students who are really excited to be doing this work. And a lot of the ways in which they've held this conversation, I've had to make them understand that a lot of their work is with other white people.
Yeah.
And to really open and crack open this conversation. And so those are just some thoughts I have immediately, which is why people are calling me in, because they're wanting to do more work with themselves, but they are trying to figure out and to set up a plan for that work.
Right. And they need facilitation or all of that. So what's interesting is that when the pandemic hit, I was actually, because my background is acting, I'm an actress, singer, and I was in the play Gloria, A Life, about Gloria Steinem. And it was this beautiful montage of vignettes, stories. And the most important part of it for me was what you just said. It's the conversations. It's the one-to-one conversations, sharing what are we experiencing, what's wrong, how can we make change, how can we be aware, how can we continue to have these conversations. And she says that a movement starts one conversation at a time, which is what's so beautiful about what you're doing, how you're shifting to Lovelace Consulting Services, Inc., because it is getting into the conversation.
Absolutely. And I giggled a little bit because I know Gloria, right? And because and I know that, when I say know her, I've been in space with her. And
yeah, fascinating woman, isn't she?
She is. At the same time, I can't say that, she has lots of dear friends. But I am in her orbit. I've been in her orbit, and I appreciate her. And she, for one, is a person who I think was really, really having these conversations about racism and really pushing systems back when many and primarily the sort of white feminist spaces were not having those conversations. And so and to this day, that's still how she operates. And I so appreciate her for that. And it is with one conversation at a time. And she is having, I think, has really intended to push white women on these topics.
Oh, and the story is so beautifully shared that the women of color were really the pioneers of the movement. And she partnered with these powerfully strong women of color. And in a way, it's almost like she gets credit but it really was their voices.
And I think that, and she continues to do that. And there are a lot of younger women of color that she's engaged. And I also think that she is attempting to do more to make sure that the credit is given where credit is due in that way. So I know that's something, and I imagine Gloria would say that has been an intention of hers, knowing that has been how it has looked for these years.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when I read a little bit about you and sort of, you have this incredible bio and just really, there's some things that stuck out to me. You talked about creating a movement within a movement.
Yes.
And what does that mean to you? What does movement within a movement mean?
So when I was, so being in the anti-violence against women or anti-gender violence work that really works across violence that's impacting all genders, right? That being in that space was predominantly white women led, and not just that, but also that you also had a process where there are more men that are moving, that are engaged in the work, but that really we as women of color found ourselves being crowded out of the conversation, while at the same time having greater numbers of homicides. 2.5 Black women are being killed at 2.5 times the rate of white women.
Wow.
Native women are being sexually assaulted at 3.5 times the rate of all women, all women. And that there, and it doesn't mean and it doesn't mean that communities of color are more violent, but what it means is that we have less access to services. We don't see ourselves in those services, and so those services being operated by predominantly white women, there has been a disconnect between the services that are offered and those who see themselves in those services. People don't necessarily, you have programs that may have 70% of the folks coming through who are people of color, but that the staffing and the leadership is predominantly white. And that continues in 2021. And to the degree then that people are not seeking help until the gun is to their head, or we're seeing them in body bags. And I should have said trigger warning, but that is really the truth. And so a movement within a movement meant that you had this very powerful movement of women that are addressing and of people that are addressing domestic violence, sexual assault, but within that context, there's still the master's tools that are being used there, where there's still racism, there's still sexism that happens in our movement, there's still capitalism that happens in our movement. And so all of the ills and issues that are happening around the world are still reflected in that movement. And so we, within the organization I was leading, Women of Color Network, Inc., we're building a movement within a movement, where we were saying we need to have a leadership pipeline of women of color, so that women of color are more present in leadership, so that the services are better constructed in ways that really meet our needs, and so that we are more centralized and visible in the work, so that survivors of color will access those services and receive adequate services that meet their needs.
So good, because you started the whole thing with that. It's not that there's more violence.
Right.
And that's the stereotype, is that it's a more violent community. But it's that they're not seeing themselves in the services.
They're not seeing themselves in the services, and they often live in services deserts, right?
Interesting.
So there was an area around Atlanta, Atlanta and around Atlanta where, so first of all, let me say, at the time, they kept showing up on the Violence Policy Center's top 10 list of states in which domestic violence homicides were occurring. And they put out this data every year. And for many years in a row, Georgia was showing up in the top 10. At the same time, we were doing some work with the domestic violence hotline, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. We did a mini project where we were seeing that their numbers were showing that there were a lot of phone calls from the Georgia area, particularly around the Atlanta area, for services. You would think that an area like Atlanta would have a lot of support and a lot of infrastructure built in that allows people to access services. But what we found is that a lot of folks were being turned away because there were not enough beds, but also people were living in areas where they just couldn't get to the services, even if they were living. So some of those folks were living in rural areas around the Atlanta area, or were living in highly populated urban areas, but not gaining access. And so both of those things came together that created an environment where the escalation of violence was happening. You know, domestic violence escalates. And so you calling for the first time, he may have just grabbed you. You call the next time, and this person may have begun to actually be physically battering you. You call the next time, this person may actually have been engaging in more life threatening behavior. Which, again, I try to remember trigger warnings, but doing things that, using weapons and using products that may be harmful to you. And then we may not hear from you again, because the next time we hear from you, you are, next time we see you, your name is in the death review process because you didn't make it. And what I'm saying is that the lack of access, a lot of this is not about about enough funding, needing enough funding and programs to expand services, but also some of this is about a lack of access because of where you live and around other circumstances. And so because of that, it's not so much that communities are more violent, it is the way in which services are available and or whether or not people see or believe that they can access those services. So while people think, so Elle, I will say one last thing, and I know that you have so much more that we need to talk about, but to just say that while people may think of there being more violence in communities of color, all of us think of domestic violence shelters and services as being primarily for white women, right? And so what ends up happening then is if we all think that, then it's less likely that we're going to access or really receive those services, or it may be way late in the process by the time we actually reach out. There are lots of other reasons for this too. Elle. We could actually do a whole show on what does it mean that that we are not accessing services in the same way.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so super passionate about what you do. It's I'm sort of blown away. I'm like, wow, we could keep going. And it's so interesting to me because it's peeling back the layers and layers of things. I actually don't really think of all shelters as for white women. So I'm curious about that. I don't know if we have time to talk about that too, but just this whole disparity of location, even feeling that it's accessible. It's really fascinating. Like but it feels a little overwhelming. Like, how do you help? And I do wonder, how do you stay grounded when this work is so personal? You have such passion toward it. I know you have your own story, your own survivor story, so you relate to these women. How do you stay grounded? How do you stay passionate?
Well, I think as the survivor, you can't, I think as a survivor in this work, it certainly is, the passion is just lifelong. I came to this work, though, not a survivor of domestic violence. So I'm one of those, I'm an individual who experienced domestic violence as a person who is working to end domestic violence. So that's another, again, there's more to say about that, but to say, and so I'm even more passionate about discussing this issue, really making it clear that anybody can become a victim of domestic violence, and anybody can become a victim of sexual assault, that it's critical to, that it can happen at any time. And it's critical to continue to raise awareness around this issue. And the way that I stay grounded, I think, is that, luckily I am among a circle of survivors and people who are constantly having this conversation. But I'm a survivor of many things, Elle. So I'm also a survivor of child sexual assault, of bullying, of teen dating violence, and a number of other factors. And so I think I have been seeking support for it. I think seeking support, seeking spaces, creating spaces of support. Like I said, I started doing that at 19. I just think it's built in me. It's just how I do. It is natural to me, I think, to create and seek support. And so that is, I think, how I get through, and I breathe through it. And I'm also very close to my kid, and very close to my mom, and very close to my family. And I think that is how I've been able to manage. My faith is very critical to me. There are a number of different things.
Yeah, because a lot of your work is thankless. You're serving, you're working, you're advocating, but often probably don't get a lot of feedback. I mean, is that true, or how do you experience? Because I just think of, nonprofit work. I think of social justice issues as it's a very up and out energy, and do you get poured into?
Oh, that's really interesting. I think that there are occasionally days where, you're doing this work and you're grinding and you do feel like, man, this is thankless work, like literally in that language. But at the same time, when I think about survivors who on a day-to-day basis are just attempting to live, just trying to make sure that their kids are safe and are navigating what they're experiencing in their homes, then I don't really need thanks from them, right? Like, I don't need that. I need to know that I am doing what I can to chip away at this broader issue of gender-based violence, and of child, sexual assault, and all the other areas that I'm passionate about. And so I think there's that. And I also think at the same time, we do take time out at times to, really to celebrate, or to at least acknowledge, changes that we've made. And I think, I've listened, I took it upon myself, Elle, to listen through some of the other shows that you've done. And I know that one of the things you have talked about in your shows, are, the first creative
right.
memories that people have.
Yeah.
And, for me, I realized that dance has been something that has weaved through my whole life. That, my mother's brothers were musicians, and while I don't have the exact memories, I see the pictures. So it almost feels like it's my memory of being like 2 years old, standing on a kitchen table while they are playing drums and I'm dancing on top of the table, right? I was always sort of a dancer in that way. I remember being in elementary school, and a teacher, a woman of color teacher, noting, I guess, pretty early in this very diverse classroom, though, but that I was kind of this dancing, like I like to dance. I must have always had sort of joy sort of emanating from me in that way. And so she would play the song Born Free, and then would have me dance. I would just sort of do this freestyle dance for the whole class. I was like, I had to be like 7 or 8 years old. And it was a way I realized that that my dance and my self-expression has always been both for my own joy, but also in a way as kind of a calming, as kind of a gathering place. So for the family, I'm like the gathering place of dancing with my little spindly, legs on top of a table, or being in a classroom and being the thing that the teacher says, okay, now it's Tanya, why don't you dance for us? And in a way that I think helped to sort of create. So I think I'm still doing that, and I'm still creating those spaces, and I'm still and I'm still dancing, Elle. So even if it's just me here in the midst of COVID, I'm still dancing. I'm still doing what I can to just to relieve any of the stress or and I think to generate joy and to tap into joy for myself.
Oh, that's so great. And I love that the song was Born Free.
Yes.
And what an incredible teacher to see that and to call that out of you. And, you know, you've talked several times about influential women in your life, the teacher, the college professor. And, you know, I can just see you because you have this incredible energy. You have this passion, this authenticity. You're very direct but loving. And, you know, in reading your story and chatting with you today, you live you. You live true. And I can just see this little dancing girl to Born Free. It's beautiful.
Yes, I have. I've been really blessed. My mom, who just really is, and I say almost every interview, almost every chance I can, to always lift her up. Her birthday is next Friday, and to really just know that she truly is and has always been my inspiration, the smartest person I know. She just really remains to be the smartest person I know, and the most influential person that I know. And I think that, and one of the things that for some reason, somehow, she also made sure that I understood that she was not the only source of support that I needed. So she encouraged and allowed me to, you know, sit with the lady who taught me how to crochet when I was 9 years old, or to, you know, build community with her friends. And so I could go to them to talk about my mom is upsetting me. And even though they probably gave a report back, it didn't matter. They never made me feel like I couldn't say what I needed to say. And so she allowed me to have all these aunties in my life. And so, and then in college and other spaces, and even now, I just have always had these people who pour into me, as you said, Elle. And I just believe that is my greatest blessing. I think that is my God who looks out for me.
And now you are paying that forward. You are doing that for so many other people. And you did that for me today. So thank you.
Well, that's wonderful, Elle. And I just feel so blessed too by this opportunity to meet with you. And while I wasn't expecting this kind of frank conversation, I'm grateful for it. I feel so excited, and it gives me more and more hope about frank and truthful conversations that can continue to happen to make change.
Awesome. Can you share with our listeners where they can learn more about you and your new venture?
Yes. So Lovelace Consulting Services, Inc. My name is Tonya Lovelace, and that is Tonya. And I say that because there are many ways to spell Tonya, but that is the way you can look me up on LinkedIn. My website is almost completed, and so it hasn't yet been launched, but you can very easily find me at LinkedIn. And if you're interested in meetings, speaking, or if you would like to have a consultant come and support you and help you bring your projects to the finish line, I'm here to support you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation today, Tonya.
Thank you so much, Elle. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of She Made It. Our goal is to reach as many women as possible through this podcast to inspire them to find their truest, most creative selves. And we need your help. Apple Podcasts is way more likely to put our show on other people's radar if we have reviews. If you've enjoyed even just one episode of She Made It, we'd be so honored if you left a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. It's easiest to do this through the Apple Podcasts app on your phone, and if you're not sure how, just go to elzimmerman.com/review if you need some instructions. Thank you so much in advance. We cannot wait to hear from you.